Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the sponsor of this conference for inviting me to speak. I think about what's going on, what's happening today as an economist, but I feel it as a father. My wife and I have 3 daughters aged between 19 and 25. And when I see what's being done to their future, I'm really angry. Back in September, when they were talking about taking $700 billion to unclog the financial system, I wanted to take Henry Paulson and yank him out of the TV screen and say, "You keep your hands off my daughter's future." But he got away with it. And I had to. For me, it was like sitting there watching my house being ransacked by a gang of thugs. And now we've got a new gang of thugs, and they're going to do the same thing. So anyway, that's how I feel. We'll go back to how I think. Okay, so I just want to make 3 points. First point is that this is a big bill, but is not a big stimulus. The second point is that a better alternative would be to cut the employer portion of the payroll tax. And the third point is that these are dangerous times, and we should be trying to craft policies that reduce risks, not policies that increase risks. So the first point, that this is a big bill but not a big stimulus. Before he joined the Obama team, Larry Summers famously set out criteria for a fiscal stimulus, that it should be timely, targeted, and temporary. Well, this stimulus bill does not meet those criteria. It does not meet the criteria that any economist would set for a fiscal stimulus. That is not the purpose of the bill. The main purpose of the bill is to transfer huge amounts of income to favored constituents in the Democratic Party. So it is a big bill. It is not a big stimulus. So, and I think if economists could craft something, if this bill were being negotiated between economists from the Democratic side and economists from the Republican side, they would probably wind up about where Greg Mankiw suggested, which would be a cut in the payroll tax to be followed by a subsequent scheduled increases in the gasoline tax. That's probably what economists would be talking about. This bill isn't even close. It's being designed by politicians. So a big bill, not a big stimulus. My second point is that a better alternative would be to cut the employer portion of the payroll tax. Now, I'm thinking of something like a 50% cut, and that would be about $230 billion a year. In the long run, a cut in the employer portion of the payroll tax will have firms competing for workers, bidding up wages, and the cut would flow through to workers. But that's not what would happen in the short run. In the short run, wages are going to stay about where they are, and the cut in the payroll tax will lower the cost of hiring workers, and it would lead to increased hiring. The other thing that the cut in the employer portion of the payroll tax would do is that the revenue would flow through to profits, and profits are the key to the recovery. Let me repeat that. Profits are the key to the economic recovery. In a capitalist system, profits and losses are signals. Profits are signals to expand. Losses are signals to contract. Profits have been falling, and that's why we're seeing contraction. In the financial sector, we're seeing huge losses, and to me that is a signal that the financial sector needs to shrink. The financial sector made mistakes, the financial sector got too big, and it needs to shrink. Unfortunately, policymakers are determined to ignore those signals. They're talking about buying toxic assets, insuring toxic assets, sort of becoming joint investors with the financial sector, all things trying to fight the market signals that the financial sector should contract. They think they can force the financial sector to lend, but when businesses are losing money, it makes no sense to lend to them. And when businesses are barely profitable, it makes no sense from their point of view to borrow. So that's why we're not having lending. So we have to restore profitability, and that's why a cut in the payroll tax would be a more effective approach. The final point I want to make is that these are dangerous times, and we need to be focusing on minimizing risks. The economics profession is in turmoil right now. I mean, I haven't seen this come through in the mainstream media at all, but I've followed the leading academic economists discussing on the internet, with writing essays and commenting, and the disagreements are big, they are bitter, and they are personal. And that extent of disagreement tells me that there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And when there's a lot of uncertainty, I think it's important to pay attention to what Nassim Taleb calls the black swans, or the improbable events that could have serious consequences. So if you look at something like the Congressional Budget Office forecast, that if we do nothing, the unemployment rate will be 10 or 11%, and if there's a stimulus, that the unemployment rate will be a couple percentage points below that, that's looking at a very narrow window, the center of the bell curve, so to speak, that's ignoring the possible extremes. And one possible black swan or extreme scenario would be that the unemployment rate doesn't stop at 10 or 11%, but firms keep laying off workers, they keep losing money, there's more shutdowns, more layoffs, more shutdowns, and you wind up with something like 15% unemployment for many years. That would be a Great Depression scenario. It's unlikely, but it's something we should be concerned about. But there's another black swan out there that we should be concerned about, and that would be what would happen if investors lose confidence that the United States government is going to be able to repay its debts. And that would be an even worse catastrophe than the Great Depression. In that kind of scenario, first of all, you would have no banking system. In other countries, this has occurred where the government has lost the confidence of investors, and it's known as a sovereign debt crisis. And I can't think of a single sovereign debt crisis in which the banking system of that country has survived. Basically, money flies out of your banking system when people lose confidence in the government's ability to repay its debts. So it would be an utter financial catastrophe. And I'm not saying it will happen, and I'm not saying it will happen if we enact the fiscal stimulus, but we should not be tiptoeing up close to that line, and we should be worried about that risk. So policies should be focused on trying to minimize both of those risks. We shouldn't be trying to run the risk of another Great Depression. We also should not be trying to run the risk of having a sovereign debt crisis. And I would sleep better, as far as the stimulus bill is concerned, I would sleep better if nothing were done than if it were enacted. The worst that they could do is enact the stimulus bill. A better thing would be to do nothing, because I think that would reduce the risk of a sovereign debt crisis and not really do much to increase the risk of a Great Depression, because it's a big bill but not a big stimulus. A better thing to do would be something like cutting the employer portion of the payroll tax, which would cost less and put us less at risk of having a sovereign debt crisis, at the same time do more to reduce the risk of a Great Depression. And that's what policy focus should be on, is avoiding those two extreme risks. We cannot afford to have a politically determined policy that greatly increases the risk of a debt crisis while doing way too little to reduce the risk of the Great Depression.